Chaoshen wrote poems the way some men breathed, quietly, without announcing the fact of it, until someone placed a hand over the mouth of his life, and he realized how much he had depended on air. He was not yet a celebrated scholar. No one in the capital was reciting his lines. No examiner had ever paused over his papers with startled approval. He was only a young man, in a robe too plain to be remembered, carrying a brush worn smooth by use, and a small faith that the world, if met honestly enough, might one day answer in kind. It was not a fashionable faith. Even he knew that. That spring, when the plum blossoms had already fallen and the newer leaves were just beginning to show their clear green edges, he went out beyond the city to visit a friend's family estate. His friend had invited him several times before, and Chaoshen had always found reasons to refuse. Official households made him uneasy. Their courtyards were too clean, their servants too quiet. Their walls seemed to preserve not only privilege, but a different kind of weather. Still, he went. The road that day was dry and pale under the sun. Willow branches leaned over the ditches, and a soft wind kept lifting the dust in little sighing swirls around the hems of travellers' robes. Chaoshen rode most of the way in silence, his satchel hanging from one shoulder, while his friend, whose given name was Shu Weixiong, though Chaoshen usually called him simply Weixiong, spoke without interruption about exams, rumours, official appointments, and the foolishness of another scholar they both knew. When the estate walls finally came into view, whitewashed and severe against the green beyond them, Weixiong turned in his saddle with a grin that was too pleased with itself to be innocent. "My cousin is staying with us," he said. Chaoshen gave him only a glance. "And this concerns me. Why? Because she asked whether I knew any scholars who could write without sounding like they were copying old men." Chaoshen snorted. "Then you should have said no. I said I knew one who occasionally remembered he had a soul." Chaoshen's mouth tightened despite himself. "You have a vulgar way of praising people. It keeps them modest. It keeps them annoyed." Weixiong laughed. "Good. Annoyance sharpens the mind. You may need yours." Chaoshen turned his gaze toward the estate gate, as if that ended the matter. But Weixiong was not a man who accepted the ending of a matter simply because someone else wished it. "She reads everything," Weixiong added. "History, verse, memorials, anecdotes, philosophical nonsense from dead men no one else can tolerate. She says most scholars mistake Polish for thought." "That sounds exhausting." "She is," Weixiong said cheerfully, "but she is never dull." Chaoshen said nothing, yet some small part of him, against reason, became alert. The gate opened before they reached it. A servant bowed, took the horses, and led them through the outer court. The place was as exactly as he had imagined. The stone paths had been washed so clean they still held faint dampness in the cracks. Bamboo shadows trembled against white walls. Somewhere deeper in the compound, a qin was being practiced, the notes so measured and restrained they sounded less like music than a discipline. Weixiong's family received him with formal kindness. There were the expected inquiries after health, after travel, after his studies, after the examinations. Chaoshen answered properly. He knew how. Men like him survived on proper answers. It was only later, after the first courtesies had been satisfied and the household had relaxed into its afternoon rhythm, that Weixiong led him toward a smaller side hall opening onto a garden court. "This is better," Weixiong said in a lower voice as they passed beneath a carved lintel. "Less audience. My aunt says poetry should be tested where tea can cool naturally." That sounds less like a proverb and more like a household habit. In good families, the difference is often difficult to detect. The side hall was modest by the estate standards, which meant it was merely beautiful rather than imposing. One wall stood open to the garden, where a square of sunlight lay on old brick, and a potted camellia still held one late red bloom among dark leaves. A painted screen divided the room, not fully, but enough to preserve the shape of propriety. On one side of the screen stood the low table where he and Weixiong were invited to sit. On the other, invisible but not absent, the women of the inner household might listen, speak, or choose not to do either. Tea was brought, clear, fragrant, poured without a sound. Chaoshen had just lifted the cup when a woman's voice came from behind the screen. "If young Master Chow truly writes from the heart," she said, "then let him answer one line." It was not a shy voice. It was not musical in the manner of women men like to praise in poems written by those who had never really spoken to one. It was steady, level, and so clean in tone that it seemed to leave no room in which pretense could settle. Wei Xiong's eyes widened in theatrical delight. He leaned sideways and mouthed, "She challenges you." Chao Shen set down his cup. "What line?" he asked. For a moment there was only the rustle of silk, and then the same voice said, "In a world that measures men by their names, what is left when the name is taken?" The room changed. Not visibly. The garden remained the garden. The tea remained tea. Somewhere outside, a servant crossed the court carrying folded cloth. Yet the line had entered like a blade, hidden inside a sleeve. It was not decorative. It did not ask for elegance. It asked whether he had a mind worth showing. Chao Shen looked at the sheet of paper set beside the inkstone. Wei Xiong, to his credit, had stopped grinning. He reached for the brush. He did not answer quickly. If he had wanted merely to impress, he could have done it in a breath. He knew enough allusions, enough polished turns, enough respectable emptiness to make any household murmur approval. But the line itself forbade that. Something in it had the exact severity of a locked gate, and the exact intimacy of a private grief. He had the sudden unreasonable feeling that the person behind the screen would know immediately if he lied. So he wrote slowly. When he had finished, he stood, crossed the short distance to the low table nearest the screen, and laid the paper there himself. His reply read, "If my name is taken, let my words remain. If my words are burned, let my silence remain. But if one heart remembers another, then even ash becomes a road home." No one spoke. It was not a dramatic silence. It was deeper than that and less deliberate. It was the silence of someone hearing something that had struck nearer than expected. Then the screen shifted. A woman stepped out. She wasn't adorned like a bride in a romance tale, nor arranged into some studied elegance meant to flatter a male observer's laziness. Her robe was pale, not white, not pink, not any colour that demanded praise, only clear and quiet, the sort of colour one noticed fully only after looking twice. Her hair was pinned simply, and in it sat a single jade ornament, old enough that the green had deepened with time. She carried herself neither timidly nor proudly. She carried herself as a person who had long ago decided that self-command was more useful than display. Her face at first glance was composed. Her eyes were not. Her eyes were too awake. She bowed with perfect propriety. "My name is Lian-Cheng," she said. "Your reply was clean." Chao Shen blinked. Clean. Wei Xiong gave a strangled laugh but wisely said nothing. Liancheng looked at him directly. "Not greedy," she said. "Not embroidered for the sake of admiration. Not trying to win the room." A faint heat rose at the back of his neck. "I didn't know the room was mine to win." "It usually is, for men with brushes." "That has not been my experience." "Then your experience has improved." Wei Zhong made a sound halfway between a groan and a laugh. "Cousin, if you continue like this, he'll believe we keep you hidden here only to torment guests." "If he is tormented by accuracy," she said, without taking her eyes from Chao Shen, "then perhaps he should write prose instead of verse." To his own surprise, he smiled. That changed something. Very little, but enough. The severity of the moment loosened, not into softness, but into possibility. Liancheng's gaze dropped briefly to the paper, then returned to him. "You wrote it," she said, "like it was meant for one person." The words landed between them with a force entirely disproportionate to their calmness. "It was," Chao Shen said. Wei Xiong's head snapped toward him. Liancheng lifted her brows just slightly. "Was it?" He should have repaired the sentence at once. He knew that. He knew the rules of speech in such a room, before such a screen, in such a house. But the truth had slipped out before caution could seize it. and once spoken, it stood there bare and difficult to disown. So he attempted dignity instead of retreat. "I mean," he said more carefully, "if a line is asked by one person, should it not be answered to that person?" Wei Xiong let out the breath he had clearly been holding and dropped his head into one hand. "A dangerous correction," he murmured. Liancheng's mouth curved very slightly. It was not a smile, in any public sense. It was smaller, more private than that. "Convenient," she said. "Convenience is one of the lesser virtues," Chao Shen answered. "Yes," she said. "That is why I rarely trust it." The breeze shifted through the open side of the hall. Somewhere in the garden, a late cicada began its rough, persistent song. Chao Shen had the strange feeling that he had stepped, without noticing how, onto a road whose beginning he could no longer see. Lian-Cheng inclined her head. "Since you answered one line," she said, "perhaps you may answer another." Wei Xiong laughed aloud this time, helplessly. "There, I told you. You've been caught." "I am not a fish," Chao Shen said. "No," said Lian-Cheng, and now the brief shadow of amusement touched her eyes more openly. "But you may still discover whether you swim." From that day onward, Chao Shen returned to the estate more often than reason could fully defend. At first he told himself it was because Wei Xiong continued to invite him, and this was true. Then he told himself it was because the estate library held uncommon commentaries and several old editions difficult to find elsewhere, and this too was true. Then he told himself nothing at all, because false explanations became tedious once the real one had acquired a face. He did not see Liancheng every time he came. The estate was too proper for such indulgence. But enough times, enough to establish a pattern that no one named and everyone noticed. Sometimes the meetings took place in the same side hall with the painted screen, though after that first afternoon she no longer remained behind it for long. Sometimes they sat at a table near the western window of the small library, where light fell clear across the paper in the late afternoons, and dust motes drifted slowly through the beams, like patient thoughts. Once, when the weather turned, and the first hard rain of the season struck the tiled roofs, they spent nearly an hour under the eaves of a covered walkway, discussing a poem neither of them liked and discovering, in their shared dissatisfaction, an intimacy more dangerous than admiration. She did not behave like the women in the romances Wei Xiong secretly mocked and secretly admired. She did not lower her gaze merely because men expected it. She did not scatter charm in hopes that someone would gather it up gratefully. She met him in the only way that mattered to her, as though his mind either deserved the effort of hers or did not. The first time she dismissed one of his lines as weak, he nearly offended himself. It was late afternoon. A thin, pale light had settled over the garden. He had brought a short set of verses written the night before in a noisy inn, when the walls had been so thin he could hear a merchant snoring in the next room, and the oil lamp smoked every time the wind worried the shutters. He had been rather pleased with one image in particular, and placed the paper before her with more confidence than discretion. She read it in silence, one hand resting lightly near the page. When she finished, she tapped the final couplet once with her fingertip. "This line is lazy," she said. He stared. "It is not." "It is," she replied. "You know how to make sound. That is not the same as saying something." "It says exactly what I mean." "No," she said, and folded the page back toward him. "It says what you think a reader expects to feel." He should have laughed it off. He should have thanked her coolly and gone away with his pride arranged into some manageable shape. Instead, he heard himself ask, with an edge he could not soften in time, "And what do you think I mean?" The room went still around the question. Lian-Cheng looked at him much longer than courtesy required. There was no cruelty in the look. That made it worse. "I think," she said at last, "that you are lonely." The word should have embarrassed him. It should have made him defensive or angry, or at least properly amused. Instead, it landed with an almost physical accuracy, like a hand placed without hesitation over a wound hidden beneath layers of cloth. He let out one brief laugh, without joy. "You are serious?" "No," she said, "only precise." Then after a pause in which her own composure thinned for the first time, "So am I." Something altered between them then. Not confession, not yet. Not the sweetness of romance. Recognition. Like two people standing under the same rain and realizing all at once that the other one is getting wet too. After that, their talk changed, though none of the forms around it did. They still spoke of books, poems, histories, the conduct of ministers, the failures of exam essays, the absurdity of men who used 6 illusions, where one clean sentence would do. But now, beneath all that, moved another current, lower and warmer, and impossible to name safely. One afternoon, she asked him whether he believed words could alter fate. He answered after some thought, "No, but I think they can prevent a soul from rotting while it waits to be struck by fate." That is a grim answer. It is a practical one. Practicality is often only despair dressed properly. Then what would you call hope? Lian-Cheng looked out toward the camellia bush in the garden, where one flower had opened too late in the season. "A refusal," she said. He never forgot that. Another day, he found her in the library with an old anthology open beside her and a commentary volume closed face down, as if she had lost patience with whatever dead scholar had thought himself authoritative. She looked up when he entered. "This commentator claims," she said without preamble, "that sincerity in poetry is inferior to elegance." He should be exhumed and argued with. The quick laugh that escaped her then was so unguarded, so young, that he felt it not as amusement alone, but as privilege. "You see," she said, "that line is alive. Why won't you always write like that?" "Because no examiner wishes to be exhumed and argued with." Coward! Realist! Coward with neat handwriting, then. He sat opposite her. "And you?" She turned the page lazily. "I am a person with enough intelligence to be inconvenient, and not enough authority to make use of it." There were moments like that, when his chest tightened so sharply he could hardly remain still. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was gentle, though at times she could be. But because she was exactly the kind of mind he had not believed the world would permit him to meet. And, having met it, he found that ordinary life had become intolerably narrower than before. It was during one of those afternoons that he brought her the longer poem. He had written it at an inn, by an oil lamp that smoked too much and burned too low, with rain whirring the shutters all night, and the smell of damp straw rising from the floor matting. He had begun, as he always began, with one line, then another, then a turn, then a refusal of the turn, then a different line that seemed truer. But somewhere in the middle, the poem had ceased to be a poem in any usual sense. It had become something more dangerous. When he placed it before her, he did not look at her face while she read. He watched instead the edge of the paper in her fingers. She read slowly, then once more, slower still. At last she said, "What is this?" "A poem." "It does not sound like one." He forced himself to lift his eyes. She held the page slightly higher and read aloud. "If the world denies you a door, I will build one from my own bones. If they scatter your name like dust, I will gather it with my bare hands. If they ask me to forget, I will answer with my whole life. No." When she finished, she lowered the paper with great care. "This is not a poem," she said quietly. "It is a vow." His throat tightened. "It is only ink." "No," her gaze did not leave his. "It is you." For the first time since he had known her, she looked almost frightened. Then she folded the paper once. Then again, not dismissively, but as one might fold something too private to leave open in the air. "You should not write like this," she said. "Why?" Her fingers tightened around the folded poem. "Because the world punishes men who write as though they mean it." A pause. Then, lower still, "And it punishes women more." He had no answer to that, none worthy of the room or of her, or of the whole diseased structure outside those walls that had taught her to say it so matter-of-factly. At length he said only, I did not write it to be safe." "I know," she replied. The late light had shifted by then. It lay across the edge of the table, across the jade pin in her hair, across the folded poem still held in her hand. Outside, someone crossed the courtyard and called for a servant. From another wing of the estate came the faint sound of a door being closed. The world as ever went on. Lian-Cheng set the folded paper beside her. When she looked back at him, her expression had steadied, but some softness remained beneath it now. Not sweetness exactly, but trust beginning to risk itself. "If the world took your name," she asked quietly, "would your words truly remain?" He looked at her a very long time before answering. "Only," he said, "if one person remembered them correctly." This time she did not look away first. The change began so quietly that for several days Lian-Cheng almost persuaded herself it had not begun at all. Nothing visible was taken from her at first. No one forbade her books. No one locked doors. No servant announced some new household rule in a stiff voice. The side hall still stood open in the afternoons. Tea still came, when called for. Her mother still asked whether she had slept well. Her father still inquired, at dinner, whether the weather had spoiled the roads between the city and the estate. Yet the air of the house altered. It was there in the servant girl, who came twice, rather than once, to refill the brazier in her room and stayed a little longer than necessary, arranging objects that had not required arranging. It was there, in the old steward's face, when Qiao Shen's name happened to be mentioned at table, and the steward lowered his eyes with a quickness just a little too practiced to be natural. It was there, in Wei Yong's sudden carelessness, which was not carelessness at all, but the opposite, a kind of strained brightness, as though he had decided that if he laughed often enough, he might keep the world from hardening around them. Most of all, it was there in her father. Before he had watched her as fathers of his class often watched their daughters, with measured affection, with pride in her education, so long as it ornamented the house rather than challenging its foundations, with the half-absent confidence of a man who assumed time would eventually carry her into the future he found proper. Now he looked at her as if he had begun counting. One evening, toward the end of the 4th month, she was pouring tea for him in the inner room, where he received only family. The light was thinning. A servant had just lit the standing lamp, and the flame wavered once before settling behind the paper shade. Outside, rain had begun. Not a storm, only that persistent fine rain that made the courtyard stones gleam darkly and drew a clean, damp smell from the earth. Her father watched the tea fill the cup. "The magistrate Zhang's son will visit next week," he said. The pot paused above the cup for the shortest fraction of a moment. Liancheng did not spill a drop. She set the pot down, adjusted the lid, and only then asked, "Why?" Her father accepted the tea but did not drink it. "To greet us." "To greet you," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. "Chenga," he said, using the household name he had always used, when he wished to soften what he was about to make immovable. "You are not a child." "No," she answered. "I've observed that much." He ignored the edge in her voice. "Then you know there comes a time when these things must be considered." "What things?" "Your future." Her gaze dropped briefly to the steam rising from his cup. "My future appears to have become very social." A faint line appeared between his brows. "Do not be glib." "I am not being glib. I am trying to understand why a stranger's arrival should be announced to me as if the weather itself had changed." Her father set the cup down. Because he did it gently, the sound it made against the table was worse than if he had struck it. "Magistrate Zhang's son," he said, "is of good family. He has prospects, land, stability, and a household that knows its place in the world. And I am to admire him for arriving pre-sorted." Her father's mouth tightened. "You are to receive him properly." Something cold moved beneath her ribs. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Recognition, perhaps, but not the kind she had once spoken of with Qiao Shen. This was a darker kind, the recognition of a road one has seen in the distance for some time and suddenly finds under one's own feet. "What if I find him tiresome?" she asked. "That," her father said, "is not the point." "Then what is?" He looked at her in silence for a moment, and in that silence she felt the old balance between them tilt. He was still the same man, careful in speech, disciplined in bearing, severe by conviction rather than temper. Yet she understood with a clarity that made her pulse change, that kindness had always been easy for him, while her obedience remained theoretical. It was only now, because disobedience had become imaginable, that his tenderness acquired conditions. "The point," he said at last, "is that life is not a poem." Lian-Cheng did not answer immediately. The rain deepened outside, tapping now against the bamboo in the courtyard, with a sound like many small fingers. "No," she said. "If it were, perhaps it would make more sense." His expression hardened by 1 degree. "You have spent too much time with verses." "I have spent less time with them than most men spend with their vanity." Her father exhaled through his nose. "This cleverness will not help you in a husband's house." The sentence was clear enough that pretense became insulting. Lian-Cheng sat back from the table. "So we have come to it," she said. He did not soften. "Yes." She held his gaze. "And if I refuse?" There it was, not shouted, not thrown, only laid between them with perfect grammar. Her father's face changed very little. That was his power. Some men raged and so revealed themselves cheaply. He did not. He made refusal face a wall rather than a storm. "You will not," he said. "Do not answer for me." "I answer," he said, "for this household." The lamp burned steadily behind him. His shadow fell long across the matting. Lian-Cheng felt, absurdly, that if she looked away first, something essential would be conceded before a single formal arrangement had yet been made. "And if your household is wrong?" she asked. A pause. "Households," he said, "are not right or wrong. They endure." The answer struck her with more force than anger would have, because there it was, laid bare, not love, not concern, not even greed in the crude sense, but reverence for endurance itself, for continuity, name, standing, all the rigid architecture into which a daughter might be fitted like lacquered furniture and praised so long as she did not crack under use. "What if I cannot respect him?" she said. "You will learn." "What if I cannot even bear him?" "You will adjust." "What if I would rather live poorly with dignity than richly with contempt?" "Then you understand neither poverty nor dignity." She laughed once, not with mirth, but because if she did not laugh, she might say something irreparable. At that, a sound came softly from the doorway. Her mother stood there. She had not entered. She had likely been standing just beyond the threshold long enough to hear enough, and not all. In another house, the sight might have meant intervention. In this one it meant witness. Her father saw her and said, not unkindly, "Come in." Her mother did, though not with any haste. She sat at a slight remove, as if determined by her posture to prove neutrality, where no neutrality truly remained. "Why are voices raised?" she asked quietly. "They are not raised," said Lian-Cheng. Her father said at the same moment, "Your daughter mistakes opinion for authority." Her mother's hands folded under her sleeves. She looked from one to the other, and for a moment Lian-Cheng saw with a stab of pain how tired she looked. Not old, tired in the deeper way, tired of smoothing, of buffering, of trying to make a straight world feel less sharp with the soft cloth of her own silence. "Magistrate Zhang's son will visit next week," her father said. Her mother's gaze flickered once toward Lian-Cheng, then down again. "I see." Lian-Cheng's breath shortened. "You knew." Her mother did not answer at once. "I was told this afternoon," she said finally. "That is not an answer." "Cheng-ge." "No," said Lian-Cheng, and now her own voice shook despite her efforts. "If we are speaking plainly tonight, let us be plain. Did you know this was being arranged?" Her mother looked at her then, not with guilt exactly, but with the terrible helplessness of someone who has lived too long negotiating within walls. She no longer remembers how to imagine without. "I knew your father was considering it," she said. "Considering," Lian-Cheng repeated. Her father's tone cooled further. "Enough. This discussion is not improved by emotion." Lian-Cheng turned back to him. "No," she said. "Only enforced by it." The room went still. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. Then she said very clearly, every word chosen, "If you marry me to a man I cannot respect, you will not gain a daughter. You will gain a ghost." Her mother made a small sound under her breath. Her father stared at her, not because the sentence wounded him, though it did, but because it crossed some line he had never thought she would cross, while still under his roof. "You dare," he said. His voice remained low. That was how one knew he was truly angry. Lian-Cheng felt her own hands trembling beneath her sleeves, but when she spoke, her words came clean. "I dare because you raised me to tell the truth. Do not twist my own instruction against me. Then do not use your own love against me." Her father stood. The movement was not violent, yet it broke the room in two. "This is not a marketplace argument," he said. "This is your life." "Yes," she answered. "That is precisely why I would like some small place inside it." His face changed then, not towards softness, but towards something like disbelief, as if he had mistaken literacy for pliancy, wit for harmlessness, and had only now discovered the live steel beneath the polished surface of his daughter's mind. "This house," he said, "has fed you, taught you, protected you, given you a name that opens doors men like Shaoshen must spend a lifetime merely approaching." There it was, not spoken by accident, not guessed, named. Her mother closed her eyes. Lian-Cheng stood very slowly. "You should not speak of him," she said. Her father's gaze sharpened. "Then there is a him." She realized too late what she had handed him, too late to retrieve it. He continued, with terrible calm, "A poor scholar, with a neat robe and no standing. Is that what all this noise is for?" Lian-Cheng's throat tightened so hard it hurt. "This noise," she said, "is because I'm alive." "Not for long," he replied, "if you insist on trying to live against the world instead of within it." Her mother spoke then, finally, the words nearly a whisper. "Enough." Neither of them turned. Her father's face had gone still in the way a magistrate's face goes still before pronouncing sentence. "You will receive Magistrate Zhang's son," he said. "You will do so with decorum. You will remember what you owe your family, and you will not see that young man again." Liancheng's pulse was so loud now she could hear it. "What I owe," she said, "is not the same as what you may demand." He looked at her for a long time. When he answered, his voice had gone quieter still, and therefore more dangerous. "In this matter," he said, "they are identical." He turned then and walked out, not storming, not slamming doors, just walking, leaving the room altered behind him. For several moments, neither Lian-Cheng nor her mother moved. The rain thickened against the courtyard stones. Somewhere far off in the estate, a servant called another by name. The lamp flame wavered and righted itself again. At last her mother said, without looking up, "You should not have spoken his name into this." Lian-Cheng stared at her. "I did not. He did." "You defended him." "I defended myself." Her mother's fingers tightened together. Sometimes there is no difference that matters. Something hot rose behind Lian-Cheng's eyes. She hated in that instant not only the house, not only the father who had just left it, but the entire long inheritance of women being taught to survive by naming surrender wisdom. "So this is what you advise?" she asked. "That I lower my head, smile properly, and walk into a life that will kill me politely?" Her mother's face flinched, as if struck. "Do not say such things." "Why not? Because they are unfilial, or because they are true?" Her mother looked at her then, and there was real fear in her face. Not fear of impropriety, but fear of exactly how true the words were. Yet even now she could not cross the final bridge. She said only, "Your father believes he is protecting you." Lian-Cheng laughed once, and now there were tears in it. "Yes," she said, "that is what frightens me most." She left the room before her mother could answer. In her own chamber, she shut the door and stood with both hands pressed flat against it, breathing hard as though she had run a great distance, rather than cross 3 inner courtyards and 1 corridor. The room looked unchanged. Her books lay where they had always lain. The small table beneath the window still held the unfinished commentary she had been pretending to read for 2 days. The jade pin case sat open on the dressing stand. A servant had folded her shawl over the chair with habitual care. Everything looked unchanged. That was the horror of it. She crossed to the window and pushed it open wider. Rain smell entered at once, cool and green and faintly metallic. Somewhere beyond the wet bamboo and layered roofs and white walls, beyond even the estate lands, Chou-Shen existed under the same sky. She thought of his face when she had said, "If a line is asked by one person, should it not be answered to that person?" She thought of the vow poem folded in her sleeve drawer, hidden beneath ordinary papers. No servant would bother unfolding. She thought of the way he had once looked at her across a table flooded with late sunlight, and answered a question no one else would have heard beneath the words she had chosen. A movement at the outer screen made her turn. It was only her maid, little Yu, carrying fresh folded cloth. Yu entered, set the cloth down, then hesitated. "Miss, what is it?" Yu's eyes flickered toward the door, then back. "The steward says," she whispered, "that from now on, if young Master Shu's friend comes, the message is to be sent first to the master, before anyone admits him." Lian-Cheng felt the room tilt. Only slightly. Enough. "Did the steward say why?" Yu swallowed. "No, miss." But they both knew. Lian-Cheng looked back out at the rain. Her hands had stopped trembling. That was worse in some ways. Trembling at least suggested the body still expected mercy. Calm came later, when one understood its absence. "Thank you," she said. Yu lingered. "Miss, should I bring more lamp oil tonight?" Lian-Cheng almost asked, "For what? For reading? For waiting? For trying to outwrite a household?" But Yu was only frightened for her in the small ways a servant girl could be frightened, and she had no right to answer fear with bitterness. "Yes," she said instead. "Bring more." When Yu had gone, Lian-Cheng crossed to the sleeve drawer, drew out the folded poem, and opened it once more. The ink had dried days ago, but the words still felt alive under her fingers. "If the world denies you a door, I will build one from my own bones." She closed her eyes. Outside, the rain went on. And somewhere else, under another roof, she knew with a certainty beyond reason that Chou-Shen had not yet been told, but would be. And once he knew, the world would begin to close around both of them in earnest. The wedding took place in weather so clear it felt indecent. There was no storm to darken the road, no sudden wind to tear at the red canopy, no omen in the sky bold enough for servants to whisper over. The morning was bright, the paving stones dry, the household banners newly shaken out and hung in perfect order. The kind of day people later called auspicious, because it had not visibly objected. Lian-Cheng sat before the bronze mirror, while 2 older women adjusted the ornaments in her hair. Neither woman spoke more than was required. That was its own mercy. There are silences that judge, and silences that protect. These women, with their practiced hands and lowered eyes, had seen enough daughters carried from one house to another to know when speech would only bruise what was already breaking. The red bridal robe lay heavy over her shoulders. The color did not feel festive on her skin. It felt like being wrapped in a formal wound. One of the women lifted the edge of her sleeve and smoothed it carefully. Another fastened the next clasp and said very softly, "Do not let the pins catch when you bow." The advice was practical, which made Lian-Cheng love her for it in that moment. No one said, "Be brave." No one said, "This is for the best." No one said, A good daughter accepts. Only, do not let the pins catch. From beyond the inner rooms came the layered sounds of preparation, the tread of servants hurrying across the stone court, the muffled thud of something ceremonial being set in place, distant male voices rising and dropping, the first testing strokes of wedding music outside the gate. Lian-Cheng looked at her own reflection. The face in the mirror was recognizable. That was the horror of it. The brows were still hers, the mouth still hers. The eyes... She looked away from the eyes. On the small table near the mirror lay the one thing she had kept hidden until the last possible moment, the folded copy of Chao Shin's vow poem, worn soft along its creases from too many openings and too many closings. She had not meant to take it out. She had not meant to need it. But morning had come, and with it the room full of red, and the thought of entering another house carrying only what had been chosen for her had become unbearable. One of the women noticed the folded paper. Her hand paused only once before resuming its work. "Something to take with you?" she asked, still not looking directly at it. Lian-Cheng's fingers closed over the poem. "Yes." The woman nodded. She asked nothing more. When the final ornament had been set, when the veil had been arranged, when the robe had been smoothed and the sash tied and retied until all lines fell correctly, they stepped back. One went to the door and called that the bride was ready. The phrase moved through the house like an official seal pressed onto wet clay. Her legs had not forgotten how. At the threshold, her mother stood waiting. Her face was composed so carefully it had become transparent. Under the powder, under the proper arrangement of hair and robe and expression, grief burned like a lamp placed behind thin paper. Liancheng looked at her once, and knew with perfect certainty that if her mother touched her now, even lightly, she would not be able to cross the room. So her mother did not touch her. She only adjusted the edge of the veil by half a finger's width, and said, almost soundlessly, "Walk steadily." It was not blessing. It was the best form of love the moment allowed. Lian-Cheng inclined her head. Then she walked. When the procession reached the Zhang household, the city had already made a story of it. Children ran alongside the route until servants drove them back. Women in upper windows leaned through carved railings to watch. Men in roadside tea stalls commented on the quality of the horses, the weight of the gifts, the fortune of a daughter who entered such a house, the fortune of a son who had been given such a bride. Even before the gate closed behind the sedan, the event had already become public property, arranged into satisfaction and summary by mouths that had not once asked what sort of life a person could build if she entered it against her own heart. The household received her properly. That was the first cruelty. If someone had shouted, if the mother-in-law had shown a vulgar face, if the groom had been openly brutal, then the mind might have found a clear shape to resist. But decorum is harder to fight. It leaves no bruise that anyone of standing will acknowledge. Her husband bowed when he was meant to bow, smiled when he was meant to smile, accepted congratulations with the well-fed modesty of a man who had never had to imagine life beyond what had been prepared for him. He was not ugly. He was not coarse. He was merely a man in whom nothing truly awake had ever been required. That, more than ugliness, made him unbearable. At one point during the ceremony, while the formal words moved around them and the red candles burned upright and steady, she heard someone near the side of the room murmur, with satisfied approval, "A proper match." The phrase reached her like sound under water. Proper. As if what was being joined here were not two lives, but two columns of account. She bowed when required. She turned when required. She endured the incense, the kneeling, the wine, the witnessing, but she did not smile. Not once. By late afternoon, the news had already reached the city. Chao Shin heard it in fragments before he heard it clearly. A bookseller mentioned that the Zhang household had sent for especially fine paper. A stall-keeper remarked that the wedding processions had delayed carts along the West Road. A pair of scholars passing each other outside the exam quarter spoke with that casual certainty men reserve for things they find both interesting and irrelevant. "So it's settled," one said. "Yes, she is lucky." Of course. Lucky. Chao Shen kept walking. He did not realize until some time later that he had passed the turn to his lodging. That evening, Wei Xiong came to him, face already arranged into the sympathy of a man who has spent half the day deciding whether a thing should be said aloud, and knows upon arrival that it must. They sat in the poor light of the rented room, while the alley outside slowly darkened and the neighbouring tenants began their nightly noises. Bowls being set down, a child crying briefly, the cough of an old man somewhere below. Wei Xiong did not make him ask. She did not smile, he said quietly. Chao Shen looked at him. Wei Xiong swallowed. Not once. The sentence entered the room and did not move. Chao Shen's hand was resting on a page he had been pretending to revise. He looked down and saw, with strange clarity, that he had written the same character twice in 2 different places, and completed neither. Not once. He thought of her standing beneath red silk, with that stillness she wore when she refused the world the satisfaction of reading all its damage on her face. He thought of how many people would later call that pride, how many would say coldness, how many would say poor temperament, how many would decide a woman's silence was the flaw of the woman rather than the indictment of the room that had driven her into it. Wei Xiong said something else then. It took Chao Shen a moment to understand the words. My aunt says she looked pale. My uncle says the match was advantageous. The women of the household are all saying different things. What things? Wei Xiong hesitated. Say them. He did. Some said the new bride was too educated and did not know how to relax into ordinary domesticity. Some said she answered properly but without warmth, which in a daughter-in-law was more suspicious than open disobedience. Some said she sat at the window for long periods and seemed to be listening for something outside the wall. Some said her husband was already displeased because she did not make enough effort to please him. One woman had said she was proud enough to be wasted on any house. Another had called her fragile in the mind. Chao Shen listened to every version. Each one was a theft. Not because all were false, some contained pieces of visible truth, but because every mouth that repeated them stripped meaning from the facts. The silence became arrogance. The grief became instability. The refusal to perform gratitude became deficiency of character. He understood then, with a bitterness so clean it almost steadied him, that public speech could erase a woman as effectively as burial. It did not need malice, only repetition. She is still herself, Wei Xiong said, almost pleadingly, as if Chao Shen might somehow hear too many of these voices and begin to doubt the person he loved. Chao Shen turned toward the window. Outside, evening rain had begun in a thin, even fall. I know, he said. His voice sounded to his own ears as if it had travelled from a considerable distance. Inside the Zhang household, Liancheng learned quickly the geometry of her new prison. The rooms were not ugly. The service was not poor. The order of the house was exact. That was what made the first week so difficult to name. Her mother-in-law observed forms with smooth precision and the perpetual smile of a woman who had made a religion of correct appearances. No harsh word was spoken that another household could have called cruelty. No blow was struck. No door was locked in anger. Yet every corridor taught Lian-Cheng that she had entered a place where human feeling would be tolerated only if it presented itself in ways already approved. On the 3rd morning, while a servant arranged the dressing table, her husband said, almost amiably, "You should not look so grave in front of the household. It suggests dissatisfaction." Liancheng sat before the mirror with one hand resting near the comb. It would be dishonest to suggest delight. He laughed, because he thought she meant to be witty. Women are rarely asked to be so exact. I was not aware truth changed by gender. At that, he looked at her properly for the first time since the wedding. Not with love, not even with annoyance exactly, but with the dawning unease of a man who realizes he has married not merely a body and a pedigree, but a mind that does not wish to fold itself politely into his comfort. Later that day, a servant girl lingered in the doorway and said to another, not quite quietly enough, "The young madam hardly touches her food." The answer came in the flat, practical tone of household women everywhere. She must learn. Learn what? How to swallow without appetite. How to speak without saying. How to exist without being mistaken for herself. Lian-Cheng sat by the window and watched rain collect at the lip of the roof and fall in steady silver threads to the courtyard stones below. Her hands lay folded in her lap, so tightly that the nails had marked crescents into her own skin. At first she had thought survival might be managed by endurance. She had always possessed discipline. She could sit still through wrongness. She could answer properly. She could preserve an inner room no one else could enter. But marriage to a man one did not respect did not merely insult the spirit. It dissolved sequence. Morning came, and one had not chosen it. Noon arrived, and one had spent hours listening to speech that left no mark because it carried no life in it. Evening descended, and another night must be crossed in a room where everything arranged itself toward duty and nothing toward understanding. She began to feel not actively miserable, but erased in installments. Then one afternoon, she heard it. 2 servants, speaking in the screened passage, beyond the room, with the half-careless tone of women who believe the person inside has either slept or ceased to matter. That poor scholar, they say fever, died last week. The rest vanished, not because they stopped speaking, because the world narrowed to a point and all sound was drawn through it, until meaning tore. Chaoshen. For a few seconds, she sat perfectly still, because the body sometimes refuses to understand before the heart has made room for what it must contain. Then the spool of silk she had been winding fell from her hand and rolled soundlessly beneath the table. One servant murmured something. Another answered. Their footsteps passed on. Lian-Cheng did not bend to retrieve the spool. Chaoshen was dead. The sentence should have brought tears. It brought nothing. Nothing at first. Then a coldness so complete, it seemed to replace the blood in her veins. She thought of the side hall, the painted screen, the library window, the vow poem folded beneath her sleeve papers, the single look that had once passed between them and changed the shape of the world. She thought of him standing outside the estate gate and not being admitted. She thought of all the words neither of them had been permitted to finish speaking. Most of all, she thought with terrible clarity, the one person who knew what I meant is gone. It was not marriage alone that ended her, not humiliation, not obedience, not the husband's house. It was this, the extinction of witness. That night, she took out the folded poem and read the lines until the candle guttered. If they ask me to forget, I will answer with my whole life. No. She held the page in both hands, then looked up at the beam above the bed. The room around her remained orderly. The cushions were straight. The washstand was neat. The lacquer box was closed. The candle burned as candles burn. The ordinary shape of the room made the decision easier. There are moments when despair is loud and ragged, and can perhaps be interrupted by noise or force or pleading. This was not that kind. This was quiet. A quiet in which the world had already withdrawn its meaning and left only the body behind to choose whether to continue without it. She stood. In the city, Chaoshen tried to study. For 3 days after hearing the rumors of her life in the Zhang household, he forced himself into the motions of scholarship, as if the body, if kept long enough in familiar habits, might begin to believe in a future again. He rose before dawn. He washed. He lit the lamp when the sky was still dark. He opened texts. He copied out passages. He revised one essay on provincial grain policy until his own handwriting became hateful to him. None of it held. The first failure was subtle. He would come back to himself and find that his brush had hovered above the page for an unknown stretch of time, while his mind replayed some remembered turn of Lian-Cheng's voice. The second failure was meaner. He began writing sentences that were academically correct and spiritually dead. Even he could hear it. Once, he drafted half a response to an examination question on local administration, and reading it over, discovered he had used the word endure 3 times without noticing. He crumpled the sheet and threw it toward the wastebasket. It missed. By evening, the cough that had hovered at the edge of him for days settled lower in his chest. "You are not well," Wei Xiong said the next morning, entering without ceremony, and finding the room cold, the breakfast untouched, the page before him still blank. "I am employed in becoming disappointing." Wei Xiong ignored that. He took the paper from in front of him, read 3 lines and grimaced. "You would fail yourself for this." "Yes. Then why keep writing it?" Chao Shen looked at the abandoned lines. "So I can measure how far the mind can rot while the hand remains trained." Wei Xiong sat down heavily. For a while, neither spoke. At last Wei Xiong said, "Come outside, eat something." "I'm not hungry." "That is not a personality trait. It is a problem." Chao Shen almost smiled at that. Almost. But when he rose too quickly, the room tilted. He caught the edge of the table. Wei Xiong was beside him at once. "Sit down." It passed. "Sit." He sat. It did not really pass. The fever came lightly at first in the evenings, a flush at the temples, a strange brightness behind the eyes, the feeling that his own skin held too much heat while his fingers stayed cold. He told no one except Wei Xiong, who had eyes and did not require confession. At night he woke with his heart pounding, certain he had heard his name spoken. Sometimes he had bitten his tongue in sleep. He would wake with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth and have to sit in the dark until the shaking eased. Once, he dreamt only of a table near a window and the sound of a teacup being set down with very careful fingers. The dream was so ordinary that waking from it hurt more than any nightmare could have done. He began, in spite of himself, to speak to her in the room. Not speeches, not madness, only fragments. "This line is weak." "No, it isn't." "You are severe." "No, accurate." He would hear the remembered exchange, close his eyes, and press thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose, as if the body could pinch thought itself into silence. It never worked. The news of Lian-Cheng's suicide attempt reached him on a day so grey, the whole city looked unfinished. He heard it from gossip first, then from Wei Xiong, whose face when he arrived at the door told the truth before his mouth did. "She tried to hang herself," Wei Xiong said. Chao Shen did not seem for several seconds to understand the language they both spoke. Wei Xiong continued, voice unsteady. "They found her in time. She breathes. But she has not woken." Not woken. The room narrowed to that phrase. Chao Shen rose so abruptly, his chair overturned behind him. "I'm going there." Wei Xiong caught his sleeve. "You cannot help her." "No," Chao Shen said, and his voice had gone to that strange calm it reached, only when something inside it had already split. "But I can stand nearer to where she is breathing." Wei Xiong looked at him and let go. There are moments when argument becomes cruelty. This was one. So Chao Shen went. The estate gate looked unchanged. That was its obscenity. The same white wall, the same dark wood, the same measured servant traffic beyond. Only the gatekeeper's face was different when he saw him approach. It held no pretense now, only grief worn into duty. "She has not opened her eyes," the old man said, before Chao Shen could speak. "Her mother does not leave the room." Chao Shen put one hand on the gatepost. "Can I see her?" "No." The word was expected. It still struck like iron. He lowered his head until his forehead touched the wood. Beyond this gate, beyond the layered courts and quiet halls, she lay held between breathing and absence, and he could not cross a single threshold to reach her. "Tell her I came," he said. The old man swallowed. "She cannot hear." Chao Shen closed his eyes. "You do not know that." He stood there until dusk, then longer. When he finally turned back toward the city, the first lamp had been lit inside the estate. Seen through the inner court, it burned small and steady, like a vigil no one had asked the house's permission to keep. The fever deepened after that. Not dramatically, not all at once. It simply stopped leaving. He still rose, still opened books, still sat at the table with ink and brush and paper laid out properly before him. But now, every act seemed to come from farther away, as if he were watching a less convincing version of himself, try to continue a life whose center had already gone elsewhere. He tried to prepare an essay on agricultural reform and found, after half an hour, that he had written her name once in the margin, without knowing it. He tried to revise a poem not about her and crossed out every line until the paper looked wounded. He tried to eat a bowl of noodles Wei Xiong brought, and could not finish half, before setting the chopsticks down with a look so blank that Wei Xiong, seeing it, turned his face away. One evening, Wei Xiong found him sitting in the dark with the unlit lamp before him. "You forgot." "I remembered," said Chao Shen. "I decided I was tired of pretending light altered anything." Wei Xiong lit the lamp anyway. The sudden gold made Chao Shen flinch. On the table lay broken porcelain from a cup he had dropped that morning, and not yet swept away. On the bed the quilt was twisted, as if sleep had argued with him and lost. On the chair hung the robe he had meant to brush, and had not. "You need a physician." "I need a world arranged differently. You cannot make one by dying." At that, Chao Shen looked up. The fever had thinned him quickly, not enough yet for strangers to remark on the street, but enough that the bones at his wrist stood clearer, enough that the skin beneath his eyes had taken on the faint bruised shadow of someone sleeping too near grief and too far from rest. "I am not trying to die," he said quietly. Wei Xiong's face changed, because they both knew that was true. That was what made it worse. Chao Shen was not courting death. He was simply no longer giving life reasons to remain. Near the end, the fever sharpened. He lay sweating through the quilt one night, the air in the room thick and sour with heat and medicine. His lips were dry. The pulse at his temple beat too hard. On the table beside the bed, a bowl of untouched decoction had formed a dark skin across its surface. Wei Xiong sat nearby because there was no longer any point in pretending visits were casual. At some hour deep enough in the night to strip all politeness from the world, Chao Shen stirred and reached weakly toward the cup of water beside him. His hand slipped. The cup struck the floor and shattered. The sound was shockingly loud. Both men stared at the fragments. Then Chao Shen said, in a voice already receding, "Is she awake?" Wei Xiong bowed his head. "No." Chao Shen looked up at the ceiling. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost conversationally, "Then what am I still doing here?" Wei Xiong made a broken sound. "Do not speak like that." Chao Shen turned his head toward him. "I tried," he said. It was not self-pity, only statement. Wei Xiong caught his hand. "I know." "No," Chao Shen whispered. "I don't think you do." The fever carried him in and out after that. Sometimes he muttered lines of verse under his breath. Sometimes he seemed to be listening to someone just outside the room. Once, Wei Xiong heard him say, very clearly, "That line is lazy," and nearly wept at the memory folded inside the words. Near dawn, when the sky beyond the window had just begun to pale from black to the first exhausted grey, Chao Shen opened his eyes once more. They were lucid, too lucid. Wei Xiong leaned close at once. "I'm here." Chao Shen's gaze shifted, not quite to him, not quite beyond him, but somewhere a little to the side, where memory sometimes stands when the body is preparing to leave it. He smiled faintly, not at Wei Xiong, at something smaller and more precise than comfort. "Her hands," he murmured. Wei Xiong bent closer. "What?" Chao Shen's voice was barely more than breath now. "When she folded the poem," he said, "she was afraid." Wei Xiong shut his eyes. Because that was the cruelty of it. Not a grand vision, not a supernatural sign, not even a plea. Only the remembered angle of her fingers on a page. After a moment, Chao Shen whispered, "Tell her." Wei Xiong gripped his hand harder. "Yes?" The words came slowly, each one seeming to cost him an effort now beyond bodily strength. "Tell her I kept my ink clean." Wei Xiong's breath broke. "I will." Chao Shen's eyes drifted shut. His lips moved once more, but now Wei Xiong had to lean so close his own tears almost fell against the pillow to hear it. Not prayer, not regret. Only her name. Lian-Cheng. Then the room became terribly still.